Welcome everyone to today's CFOLC special presentation, the IP Balancing Act, how to assess intellectual property as a cost-cutting value and necessary expense, presented by Stevens Law Group. My name is Angela Tice. I'm the National Membership Chair and the Northeast Regional Director, and I'll be facilitating today's session. So I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping before we actually get started. You probably noticed that your lines are muted, and that's just so that there are no distractions. We certainly encourage your questions and your comments, so please feel free to type your question in the questions area, and I will make sure to ask those questions on your behalf. I'll be monitoring that area so that we can definitely address your concerns. If you're a member of the CFO Leadership Council, you will receive 1 CPE for today's webcast. Now, to receive credit, you must be a current member and answer 4 of the polling questions asked today. We will interrupt the discussion to bring those to you and give you a chance to answer. In order to answer the polling questions effectively, you must be logged into today's session. So if you've dialed in and you want to receive CPE, you need to hang up and use the direct link provided to you at registration. In other words, you need to be on a computer in order to get CPE. Just a couple of other things. Hopefully you've noticed that since the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, the CFOLC has really pivoted to help support our community, moving all of our live events online. We hope you'll take advantage and continue to connect with us. There's a full list of online programs on our website, and CPEs are offered for current CFOLC members. So we want to keep our friends and our members connected. So if you're wondering how to become a member of the CFOLC, you can certainly connect with me after the webcast. We do have 2 levels of involvement, and membership does start the day you join. So cool thing is, if you ended up joining today and you wanted CPE today, you get CPE for today. We have a full calendar going on in October, so you definitely want to check out the website to see all the chapter events, as well as more national Ask the Expert calls like today. I want to make sure to mention, there's a couple of them listed right there, but there's so many more that are coming up, and they are on the website. But I definitely want to mention our national conference. It's happening in November. It's November 11th through the 13th, and it is now totally virtual, and is free to our premium members. So if you're interested, again, in joining the CFO Leadership Council, the conference will be free to you as long as you join as a premium member. And you do have a chance still to sign up for the masterclass with MIT Sloan. If you can make it, go for it. You'll be glad that you did. It's an incredible, incredible experience with the professors at MIT. So I highly recommend getting involved with that if you can. Finally, just want to mention that most of our webcasts and virtual discussions are recorded so that our members can check in and either listen again or listen to those you might have missed. At this time, we do not offer CPE when you're listening to the recordings. Just to kind of bring it to you while you're in that membership portal, don't forget to look up our partner experts and also other members. That's how you get in touch with them. Our partner experts are on there, and they have virtual offices where you can actually visit and find excellent information in a vast amount of areas, and you can reach out to them directly if you have a specific question or need. If you have any questions about how to do any of that, especially when it's dealing with our partners, you can talk with our National Sponsor Relations Manager, Katie Todd, or either your local marketing director. Either can help you navigate through. So that's really it for all of the housekeeping. Thanks for being patient and listening for all of that. Hopefully you'll get involved. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dave Stevens, IP and IT law attorney at the Stevens Law Group. And Dave has been helping clients to strategically build and manage IP portfolios in highly diverse technological areas for over 25 years. Backed by a seasoned team of professionals, he counsels domestic and foreign clients on all aspects of IP and handles cutting-edge legal issues for companies of all sizes. He also investigates and performs extensive due diligence on IP portfolios and mergers and acquisitions, investments, strategic sales and purchases, licensing agreement arrangements, co-venturing, alliances, and other transactions relating to strategic assets. Dave is a member of the Hoover Institute and sits on advisory boards for many venture-backed technology companies. Dave, I just want to say thank you to you for coming and offering out your knowledge today. I know our members have asked us to help them find some real solutions to challenges they've faced, especially this year, and I'm sure they'll gain great insight from what you'll be sharing. So again, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. Yeah, and I want to thank everybody for joining me here. Rarely do you see many attorneys, certainly IP attorneys, speak to CFO groups. And I think there really needs to be more collaboration, both inside your community, in your companies, in your communities, and in these different diverse groups, because there's an awful lot to learn. And hopefully there's a lot to learn here too. And special credit goes to the CFOs who invited their legal counsel to join this. I am happy to share all of my knowledge, and really the entropy just continues to grow the more you share in a community, and I'm a big believer in that. So just to get started, so we call this the IP Balancing Act, how to assess intellectual property as a cost-cutting value and a necessary expense. What we're really talking about is IP asset management. IP is a capital asset, your CFOs, and I hope I can help you through this and other talks understand IP better, understand the product that you're paying for, right? I think that's true with whatever you're paying for. And IP is often seen as kind of this black art or this specialty that you really need attorneys to understand. And I emphatically disagree with that. I think that anybody who's writing a check to pay for IP services or purchasing IP really needs to understand IP, and they can understand IP. So what's our agenda here, right? So IP asset management is really, it's about being a sophisticated consumer of IP services and protecting your IP. Because without services, you don't have any IP. You can do it internally, hire outside counsel, but you really want to be in tune with everything that's happening and not have it completely running in the background. And the more you watch, the more you understand, the more you monitor, the more value you can add to the process. I'm a big believer that CFOs, among others, should have a seat at the table for IP strategy, not just figuring out budgets and working out payment schedules, but really understanding IP and adding value by assessing the costs, but more importantly, the investments that you make. So to understand which IP is strategic and necessary to the business, you got to determine the strategic business value of the IP, each piece of IP. And keeping in mind that intellectual property is just part of the equation. And you want to ultimately understand which IP investment is necessary, right? So here's the agenda that I laid out today. I'm open to questions. We'll have question periods, and I want to talk about what you want to talk about. And I'm also open to doing smaller groups, thought circles, other groups that are interested in specific topics. So reach out to Katie and everybody else and let them know what you want to talk about, and we'll make arrangements to do that. So I'm going to go over the basics of intellectual property and IP value, understanding IP business value with cost cutting, establishing which IP expenses are necessary, and that really goes to what IP is necessary, and managing and influencing legal service costs. So I really like this part, because I think most clients, and certainly most CFOs, are greatly underserved in this area to really understand how they can optimize costs in IP. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later. I'd like to start out with a polling question first. So polling is open. How does your company view IP? As a strategic asset, a legal cost, or a speculative investment? No wrong answers here. I really want to know what you guys are thinking.
And Dave, I'm collecting that information right now. So audience, thank you so much for inputting your answers quickly so that we can get back to Dave and all of the knowledge he's sharing. I'm going to close it in just a couple of seconds. And Dave, I'll share those answers with you in just about 2 more seconds. Okay. Great. Closing that, and now I'll just share that with the audience too so that they can see. So Dave, the poll results say that 86% as a strategic asset, 7% say as a legal cost, and 7% also say as a speculative investment. So back to
wow. That is a very interesting result. Well, I tell you, it heartens me to see that at 86% see as a strategic asset. And I think whoever answered B and C, I hope they learn from these later slides we get into as far as costs are concerned, smart cost cutting and understanding IP. Very, very interesting results. So all companies have some type of innovation culture. And some companies spread it out right to the edges, and some of them have it focused in certain areas where strategy is valued and strategy they see is needed, right? Intellectual property is really the support mechanism for an innovation culture. And once you establish innovation culture for business and for tech, then you can sort out what you want to protect. And business innovation, technical innovation, they're different things, but they're two sides of the same coin because one supports the other, right? In the end, it's the business that makes the money. And you can see companies that have gone to other extremes where it's purely business and they ignore tech, or it's purely tech and they ignore business. It really needs, once you have an innovation culture and you have more stakeholders at the table, you can optimize and really exploit these innovations, whether it's business or tech, so that the business ultimately wins. Because let's face it, unless we're talking to some nonprofits here, your purpose is to earn revenue for the shareholders. And I hope I can help you do that in a strategic way so you can leverage your IP and get more revenue. That's really the point. Part of that, you want to develop a strategic IP portfolio that supports business initiatives, align value add and risk mitigation with business. The purpose of IP is about adding value and mitigating risk, right? And contracts that wrap around those, it's all about mitigating risk. Contracts are nothing more than assigning risk to the parties on the contract. And IP is the leverage for exploiting those concepts, right? You want to leverage IP in negotiations, and you want to budget for return on investment. In the end, IP is an investment. Any nickel that you spend, whether it's on strategy, filing patents, filing copyright protection, trademarks, all of that is an investment. And you need to see a return on that investment or the support of revenue that is generated with that intellectual property. So what is innovation, right? Often what you see is, at least what I see, is innovation is kind of conflated with intellectual property, right? Innovation, inventions, what's novel, what are we doing, what's different, what is our value add, what is our differentiation, right? All of these discussions around these topics, they kind of hedge around your intellectual property and what you actually own. But innovation truly are just thoughtful ideas that solve problems. Some of these things can be protected, some of them cannot. Some of them you could use multiple different types of intellectual property protection to protect your thoughtful ideas, but many of them end up being trade secrets, and that's what really drives your business. So I want to, at least for now, separate invention, protected intellectual property from innovation, because innovation is what really moves your company forward with the help of business innovation or technical innovations. Technical innovations, you think of patents, you think of copyrights, you think of trade secrets or even designs. Business innovation, some can be patented as business processes that are novel, some cannot, but they both need to be really understood and celebrated. Now, with intellectual property protection, we will go into the different types of protection that cover certain ideas, that protect certain ideas, but understanding innovation and how intellectual property plays a part in it, I think will really help CFOs to understand what is the value of this IP. Is this something we need to cut? Is it something we need to invest in? But really understanding how it supports the business. Now, innovation culture. So if anyone has read Chesborough, the open innovation initiatives and all of this, you know, the thought leadership around this, you're going to recognize this slide that I'm showing right now. Closed innovation, nowadays you see mostly in military facilities, you know, old school type things where the ideas are mostly trade secrets and they're locked down, and there's not this open invitation for outsiders to collaborate with insiders and share ideas. This is the old way of doing business. Open innovation is something you see quite often, especially around here in Silicon Valley, because there's a lot of collaboration with startups and large companies. In fact, I work mostly with startups, and I believe, you know, when you see the shortcomings of different products and services, especially since COVID hit, so many different changes, even the conference that we're using today, the different software you use, you realize that when you use these things, that there will always be a place for startups. There will always be a place for innovation outside of large companies, because some products are better developed when small groups are hunkered down and optimize them. So when you look at open innovation, some people get scared when they look at this. They see leakage, they see all this stuff, they see ideas coming in, they also see ideas going out. Now, these are innovations. This is not necessarily intellectual property, but you should understand that when you look at this funnel, you will see the different things that come in and out. You have external collaborators, you have universities, you have vendors that offer services, and even companies that partner with you and even do joint developments with you. And these get very sensitive. And open innovation can be a really great thing if you exploit it properly, if you invite it in, but also if you protect it. Without proper protection and IP strategy, open innovation is open exposure, and you want to be really careful about that. Now, I'm putting this up here because I think it's a great way to understand how any company works, whether you're bringing in vendor services and products, or providing services for other companies that are not directly related to your products, collaborating with other companies, and even spitting out intellectual property. To understand where innovation comes and goes in your company, that's where you really build the foundation of your intellectual property program, right? So again, this is still background. I want to go through what intellectual property is now. Now, we talked about innovations, and innovation is a very broad subject. Intellectual property protects very specific things. You can't protect abstract business processes. You can't protect abstract ideas in general, but you can protect things in patents, for example, that relate to unique functions, novel functions. I often say you need two things for patents. It needs to be new and it needs to be useful. Now, it also needs to be non-obvious. That's a more complex discussion, but what you want to understand from a CFO standpoint is that when you have things that are novel, having technical underpinnings, you want to look at those and see if it's worth investing in protecting with patents. Trademarks protect your brand. We're all familiar with those. The purpose of a trademark is to avoid confusion, avoiding confusion among consumers, so that when your brand is used, you're not confused with one of your customers, or I'm sorry, competitors. Your customers are not confused with your competitors. Copyrights protect content. They protect journals, expressions, artistry, but they also protect software. So you can see now where patents and copyrights can be used to protect software in different ways, where patents protect function, operation that is unique, and copyrights protect the exact code from being copied, or code that is substantially similar, pirated code. Trade secrets, on the other hand, it's unique in this group that you don't register trademarks. You don't submit trademark information to a government entity for protection. Trade secrets and trade secret processes and policies are things that are developed inside of a company. If there's one thing I want you to remember about trade secrets today, when you walk away, you're ever discussing trade secrets, your company claims they have trade secrets, you're depending upon things being kept secret inside your company, you must document it, and the documentation must be date stamped and verifiably date stamped and identified with people, human beings in the company that can verify that this trade secret exists, the details of the trade secret are documented, and that people have certified that this trade secret, you were in possession of it, and that you recorded the information. Now, the reason is because there are a couple cases that are actually going on right now where it was the company got completely blindsided that their trade secrets leaked out, and some individuals left the companies and registered, they filed for patent applications, and they registered different things. Some of them even sued for trade secret misappropriation, and they are losing those cases, and they will likely completely lose the cases because they did not have it documented. Whenever you have a trade secret dispute, you must have something documented so that you can prove to the court that you were in possession of this trade secret. You spent reasonable, you were reasonable in your resources, and you took reasonable steps to protect your trade secrets, and they were stolen. But you first of all must prove that you were in possession of this thing at a certain date before they were misappropriated. So all of these things are novel, incremental solutions to problems. These are things that are used to protect innovation. And these are the parts of the innovation that are protectable. And to understand these helps you understand what things you have in your company that are protectable. And once they're protected, what are those assets and what can you do with them? Now, in a company, you need certain IP roles and responsibilities, right? Business, technology, and legal have their own roles. And my message today is that CFOs can help oversee these different entities, understand them, and have an influence in the investment of IP protection. So I loaded up these slides. I don't normally put a lot of information content in these slides, but I'm hoping that it is a good reference for all of you, so that when you think about intellectual property, roles and responsibilities, and what you can do, you can refer back to these things and understand where these operations occur, where intellectual property comes from, and how it's managed. IP business has its own responsibilities, right? Identifying and prioritizing business opportunities. And as CFOs, you see the CEOs, the COOs seeing these things. You see how to optimize business, and you want to have your eye open to whether or not these things can be protected. And the stakeholders in the company, the different stakeholders that are in this ecosystem, need to be managed, and the costs need to be optimized so that you're not overspending, over-investing in intellectual property, and possibly keeping your eyes open for ways where you can cut out intellectual property that is not strategic to the business and possibly sell it, or group it with other intellectual property and sell it off as a separate business. And we'll get into those different things. Now, investment strategy. Now, there's different places where IP can come from. There's different places and different goals that are met when you are investing in certain types of intellectual property, right? So in the first one, intellectual property focused on your products. You want these come from, this is managing competition, really, and you want innovations that exist in your products, things that are being sold in your products, and also in the roadmap of your products. So you want to keep in mind the functions and operations and things that are novel in your products that will be in current and future products. Keeping in mind also that some intellectual property protection depends upon you filing patent applications and other documents so that you protect these things before you lose the right to protect the intellectual property. And I'll give one example. When you make, use, or sell a product, when you release a software release, if it has your inventions incorporated in that product, once you release it, if you have not filed patent applications, you lose most foreign rights. That is the right to file in foreign countries. You have 12 months from those events, one of those events, to file in the United States. So time is often your enemy. You want to keep your eye on these opportunities to protect intellectual property, invest in intellectual property, but you need to know when you need to invest so that you can preserve your rights in the United States, intellectual property protection, and in other countries if you desire to file in foreign countries. Sorry. There we go. Focus on the ecosystem. Freedom to innovate, freedom to operate. Now, intellectual property can help you protect against competitors and even your own vendors and customers from owning your intellectual property. Now, you can sell great products, but as anybody knows, products can be copied, products can be, they can be simulated, and you can have competition. But once you release your products, you need to understand that the ecosystem can change and that other stakeholders outside your immediate control can assert intellectual property protection of ideas and even the intellectual property itself if you don't protect it yourself. Patents, for example, are a first to file system. So whoever files for protection first owns that intellectual property. And it doesn't matter if you've even developed it yourself internally. If somebody gets on file first, they can ultimately own your intellectual property. They can own your technology. Wild hairs, preparing for the unexpected. You know, where could technology possibly move? Keeping your eye on your roadmap is one approach, but roadmaps often change and circumstances change. And if COVID told us anything, things can change radically, and you want to be prepared and cover intellectual property, protect your intellectual property for different contingencies. Often we do this when we're sitting with inventors drafting their patent applications, and we ask them, what if this happened? I mean, you would never say a year ago that what if a pandemic happened? People weren't really expecting this. But if you think about it now, the world is changing, and you're aware of more things that could possibly change in the near and far future. Preparing for those things starts with protecting your intellectual property. You might have ideas, inventors might have ideas, product developers for developing different features and functions of your products now. But in patent applications, you could practically dream your dreams. You don't have to have your product built or developed yet. But if you have it squared up enough where you can come up with different circumstances where your invention could be applied, even applied in your competitors' ecosystems, you can protect that with a description in the patent application. So those are the wild hairs. Now, sometimes you end up needing protection after you have no rights to the patents, right? Where you have these ideas, or maybe you never had the ideas, but you need protection in certain areas. You can purchase patents. There are patents, there's a marketplace for patents out there and other intellectual property, and it's a buyer's market. They're relatively inexpensive to get. So if you feel a company is playing catch up and they need to get some type of intellectual property assets, patent protection, you could purchase those from companies that are selling them, or even startup companies or other companies that have gone under and they're selling their assets. So uses of IP within a company, there's a whole list of them I'll put there, and I'm not going to read them off for you, but this is a really great checklist to understand examples of how intellectual property can be used. And once you understand how they can be used, you can understand more of how your company can produce intellectual property for these uses. Most recently, in fact, just a week ago, there were some leveraged transactions that were widely publicized that were collateralized entirely on their intellectual property. Companies can borrow money for different initiatives based solely on their intellectual property. And that alone should incentivize companies to have some intellectual property, file some patents. They have their own empirical value, And now there are all types of banks that are lining up to loan money. They have lots of products. In fact, banks have lots of money now. They're looking for reasons to lend them out. They're trying to create new products. And now they're leveraging intellectual property as the exclusive asset for leveraging a loan, which is an amazing breakthrough if you think about it. Intellectual property by itself has never been used solely for leverage. Large companies, Ford Motor Company, different energy companies, if they want to borrow $10 billion to build a factory or to expand out a certain product line, they will often use that as collateral, but not just as the collateral for value of the loan or the transaction, but to show that the company is innovative, that it's going to be around a while, and that it's a growing concern, and that it is likely going to be here in 10, 20 years to pay off these loans. By the way, I'm open to questions here. So if somebody wants to fire off a question to these guys, aside from the questions that we have for polling, I'm happy to entertain them in any of these slides. These are very loaded slides, lots of information. Happy to talk about what you guys would like to talk about. And Kathy, or Caroline, if you don't mind, let me know about the timing. Can you give me an idea of what we have now?
Hi, Dave.
Right now,
It's Angela. We have about a half hour.
So I thought we're about halfway through. Okay, great. So IP corporate value, a very important thing to understand when you're cost cutting. Now, I know if you guys are waiting for the cost cutting tips, they're coming, I promise you, right? So, but I want to understand a couple things, and also to watch out for other opportunities when you're looking for cost cutting opportunities. So it's all about the people, right? So people develop the intellectual property, and CFOs need to understand the intellectual property to understand how to help strategize. So you want to set up a CFO-centric reporting structure so that you can get visibility. What is this intellectual property? It's beyond what did we pay to file this patent application? What is our bill to date? What is our investment so far? And how much cost is it going to incur in the future? You need to know all those things for all the good reasons. You want predictability. You also want to compare the cost you paid for one patent, for example, and for another patent, whether it be a design patent or a functional patent. You're paying attorneys to develop these assets for you, and you want to be able to monitor these things. And if you can't monitor it, you can't measure it. And there are very definite metrics you can use to compare the cost of producing different intellectual property over time. And of course, the more patents that you file, for example, you'll have more to compare. For the most part, it's time and materials. You have a person who's drafting, sometimes charging by the hour, sometimes flat rates, that are producing a product that can be very similar from one patent application to another patent application, and you should be able to at least compare those things. And it's really important not to worship the IP. And outside the CFO's office, that happens all the time. I see it, especially if the founder, if the CEO, if he or she is an inventor on this intellectual property, these patents. You want to be able to assess it, monitor its value, and understand the creators who put it together. And rather than worship these intellectual property things and celebrate them, and you want to do all those things, you want to celebrate these things, you want to really assess the value of these things. Is this, you want to identify the IP assets separately, patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets, and you want to track the status with those who create it. And what does that mean? You don't just want to look at these assets in their own little bubble, separate patent applications, design, trademarks. You want to see how these things are used. Their value is based on how they are used. If you have patents, for example, that you are aware that your competitors and other companies are using, whether it's for a competitor product or an unrelated product, you want to know what that is, because that is what gives these things certain value. If you were to license these or enforce these patents, you would look at the income that it impacts, the revenue to the company that these patents impact, your company and other users, so you understand the licensing value and also the value for leveraging when you're negotiating different contracts and arrangements. So the more you understand about the use of intellectual property, both by your company and outside stakeholders and even unrelated companies, you'll understand more the value of the intellectual property. You want to monitor and scrutinize efficiency and budget, and nobody does it like you guys do. You want to look at efficiency, you want to look at trends, and the only way you're going to do that is to understand this intellectual property, how it's created, who is creating it, and what value is it to the business. And frankly, you also want to look at the market and look and see what are other companies paying for intellectual property. That information is available to you. Paying for attorneys to do certain things, whether you're paying, Manhattan rates of $1,500 an hour or somewhere else a fraction of that. You want to look at the value that you're creating for the money that you're spending. And once you understand intellectual property better, your company's intellectual property, the better you're going to be at assessing this and influencing this investment, this spend on intellectual property that you're paying for. And you want to map the value and the revenue to the products, to the outcomes, to your company's success based on the intellectual property. So management as a whole, CEO, CFO, COO, everybody, head of engineering, they drive the holistic approach to IP culture. But you want to be able to contain the IP protection investment so that it's smart and it actually gives you a return on your investment, even if it is an indirect return by supporting other revenue and other returns on investment. And CFOs can influence key decisions with verifiable metrics so that you can speak to the group that is doing the strategy and have an influence on the cost and on the strategy in general. So cost cutting. Now we're going to start getting into the tips, the different ways of calculating value of IP. And the important thing to just keep in mind is the focus should be on not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You want to cut costs, you want to trim legal bills sometimes. You want to make sure that you are protecting your intellectual property. You want to optimize the spend, but you don't want to lose intellectual property rights just for the sake of saving costs and fees that you pay. These are maintenance fees. Patents have maintenance fees over many years, and they continue to be expensive. And you want to be able to have a reporting mechanism to the CFO that not only tells you what it costs over time, but you want to understand the value of this thing, and you want to be able to, frankly, second guess whether you should be supporting these intellectual property investments or selling off these assets or just cutting them out. And you want to be smart about it so that you can definitely get the value from them. You want to keep M&A in mind. Now, if there's one thing that I've seen that has been great losses of value to companies is where they discontinue a product, they get out of a certain market, they want to get out of an area, and they already have dedicated groups that have developed intellectual property, products. They could be separate operating units. And what you want to do is to get in there early when you're making changes so that you can assess what is this thing, right? A good example is AMD wanted to spin off a group of producers. It was a group that was producing processing chips for routers for Cisco, for example. I know this sounds esoteric. Maybe a lot of you are technical and understand this, but picture this as a component that was being built for a certain market. Now, if they just repurposed all those engineers and sold off the intellectual property, maybe they would have made hundreds of thousands of dollars off of that transaction. That's not what they did. They kept the group together. They kept the leadership in that group together. They ended up selling it off for tens of millions of dollars to a separate company that ended up profiting from it. It was actually a valuable thing, but it was just outside the core business of AMD at the time. So when they spun it off, they got a great deal of income from it because they kept the people together. They kept the intellectual property together, the copyrights on the code, the patents on the circuits and the operations. They were able to keep this together before they stopped this product production. and the product ended up being produced by someone else at a profit, and the spinoff gave them a great amount of income. I think they also had a royalty back, and they just completely got out of the business. So preserving all of that intellectual property early on and understanding the whole ecosystem around that subcomponent allowed the company to make a great profit off of something that could have been essentially a fire sale for these assets. So when you go into cost cutting, the first thing you want to do is to leverage the intellectual capital. Now, what is intellectual capital? I call intellectual capital the capital that creates innovation, innovative ideas. I'm not saying intellectual property, right? Intellectual capital is everything around that. You not only want the intellectual property that is produced, those are things that are created in the past. If you have a mechanism, a division, a group that is producing intellectual property, creating something of value, you can put that intellectual capital together, including the individuals who are creating it, the inventors, the business, marketing, salespeople who are that intellectual capital that are keeping this growing and valuable, and selling that off separately, at least understanding that it's an entity. Right? Doesn't work every time, but I've seen so many large companies that have just broken down units and repurposed people, lost all of that intellectual capital value because they didn't keep it together and consider spinning it off. And often it's a matter of timing. They see this thing breaking down. There is this moment of decay where they realize that this company, that this portion of the company, this product group, is kind of, not within the core of the rest of the company, the core business objectives. And it starts breaking down. People start to see the tea leaves. They start to leave. They go to competitors. They go somewhere else. And by the time they shut down the system, all you've got is some aged intellectual property, and you've lost a lot of value of the intellectual capital. So you want to keep in mind all of those moving parts of different things, how they're created and how they're maintained and how they maintain themselves, so you can really see the value of these things before you make these decisions of shutting down, spinning off, or selling. Calculating corporate value. Again, this is more of what we talked about earlier. You want to have someone who understands and establish the intellectual property in the context of its use. That's what really defines the value of intellectual property, the context of its use. If you look at a patent by itself, what it claims, how it describes, who would infringe this patent, it is a very isolated and narrow understanding of the intellectual capital that is within the company that created it. So understanding how it is core to the business, how is it used in products? Does it have multiple fields of use? And I'll give you an example. Hewlett-Packard had huge patent portfolios that covered inkjets, and they had a lot of value. Inkjets was a huge amount of profit for them. They also discovered that the same technology had value in fuel injection systems for automobiles and 3D printing, which they're into now, but they weren't before. So these patents had licensing value outside their core product that could produce revenue that is in unrelated areas. To understand that is to understand the true value of the intellectual property, and more importantly, the intellectual capital and how it can be expanded into more revenue and more profits. Before you cut costs, you want to understand this. Is it worth investment? Is it worth selling off? Is it worth spinning off? Is it worth keeping the intellectual capital together as a whole to really sell something of value rather than the bare assets themselves? So, next question. Question number 2. Who has the last word on legal costs in your company? After this, as you expected, we're going to start talking about cutting legal costs, tips, how to do it. But I want to know, first of all, is it the general counsel? Is it the CFO? Is it accounting? It'd be very interesting to me to know who has the last word on the legal costs of your company.
That's great, Dave, and we're collecting that now. And because we have about 15 minutes, we'll ask the audience to do it as quickly as possible so that we can get back to your presentation, which is excellent and so informative. I'm going to close the polling, people, and now I'm going to share that with Dave. So who has the last word on legal costs in your company? I think you're going to be happy here, Dave. 33% said the GC and 67% said the CFO and 0 said it was accounting. Back to you.
I love it. I love
Yeah.
it. I love it. That is really fantastic.
You have to start
and
on.
you know what? It's surprising. I'll tell you, it is surprising. And it tells me that the CFOs, I'm probably telling them a lot of things that they already know, but I hope that some of these things that I'm getting into are going to be really useful to you, especially in the service cost cutting. Yeah, this is actually really great, right? Because especially with intellectual property, often they think it's like this black art, specialized stuff that only lawyers understand. And again, I emphatically disagree with that. I think it does. You don't need to know. You don't need a law degree or even a technology degree to understand intellectual property. You just need to understand business. And a CFO understands that as much as anybody else in the C-suite. And with collaboration with other officers, you could add so much value in the strategy around intellectual property. And I can tell you, I've seen so many companies where they're worshiping the IP and they spend a lot of time building up and maintaining intellectual property that may be better off for business purposes to sell, spin off, or shut down. And there's no better cross-check. You know, a clinical review by a CFO can have extreme value to a company and put everybody on a more reasonable footing with respect to strategy and investment in intellectual property. So yeah, so service cost cutting. There's so many ways to do this, right? And I can tell you, since COVID hit, I am getting a lot of work transferred from other firms. We're not a low-cost firm, but we work with clients to optimize legal services, right? I have a big group of attorneys who work in Utah, which gives me certainly a competitive advantage here in Silicon Valley and in either coast to keep costs down. You can often get the same quality services for much of your intellectual property outside of your expensive ecosystems and get the same value. But what's really important is that internally, you understand what you're getting. You have to understand what the value is of the intellectual property, and you have to educate yourself and understand your product well. So from the CFO's standpoint, you want to look at the value that they deliver. What are we getting for our investment in outside services? And is it measured? I can tell you it's rarely measured. It's only understood, well, measured from the numerical standpoint, but rarely is it measured for true value. And until a company understands and clearly looks from a clinical perspective of what value is intellectual property giving our company, they will understand really what are they getting for their money, and are they getting services that are focused on what you need. And I'll give you an example. Often what happens, especially in more expensive ecosystems where attorneys are more expensive on the coast, New York, Silicon Valley, is that they keep the costs down by keeping, I'm not going to say quality, but the details down. An inventor can explain their invention to the attorney. The attorney will write down and record exactly what was explained, claim it, file it with the patent office, and that's what you get. If they only spent another 20 minutes in that same meeting, maybe a half hour, they can examine your ecosystem, competitors' ecosystem, and other unrelated areas where that invention could have an impact. You expand the description a bit more, and suddenly that patent application has more value because it's more than just this thing, this nuts and bolts thing that you put inside of the product to sell your ultimate product, right? And it includes only the function that your product has. You could talk to the engineer and have him dream his dreams. What if, 3 years from now, what could this product do? What more features could you add in the same context of this invention? And you'd be amazed at what you see and what you hear. Engineers are great at solving problems. Inventions are solutions to problems. If you put a problem in front of engineers, they'll solve it. But what you don't want to do is let them choose the problem. If you expand the problem, they're going to solve all these intricate things around what you didn't even understand to start with. The engineers understand roadmaps of products and what kind of things you'll run into in making products and putting them in users' hands. Nobody understands them like they do. But if you just encourage them to expand and think outside their specific product ecosystem, you'll get so much more, and you'll get more intellectual property. And that is just the art of discussion between patent attorneys and inventors. And managers can watch outside this. Marketing people can get involved because marketing people see outside, they see the future. Sales can see what customers want. So if the customers, they can lay out what the customers want in great detail, then if those things are not available, those are problems to solve. And if you can provide these things by a description in a patent application by the inventor, you've got all these solutions, and you've got them patented and claimed early. And it's a tiny investment beyond what you would normally pay for the same patent application. And so what does it take? Just a CFO and anybody else to encourage that practice. Encourage that practice. Litigation can be managed to cut costs. And I should have a separate question about litigation here. I probably will do that next time. Is that litigation, when you hire litigators to go fight a war against a competitor or someone who's suing you, a patent troll or a competitor who's suing you with similar technology, similar intellectual property patents, you want to be able to get second opinions and second guess their strategies. Now, they're not going to want to hear about things that are going to keep them from winning. No, you need to pay us what we need to win this war. Because if you lose, you're going to pay $150 million. So it's only going to cost us a couple $1 million. So the discussion is simply, wow, this is almost like insurance. We pay a couple $1 million and we're avoiding paying $150 million. That's not where it ends. And there's nothing wrong with second guessing and getting second opinions. And I'll tell you a story about one. I was working with a client that was fighting a patent troll. And you think, oh, it's just an expense. You need to fight them and eventually settle for some amount. Not true. The litigators who were working on this, it was a big New York firm. They were paying over $1,000 per hour. They spent 10 months arguing and negotiating with this patent troll. They handed it to me for a second opinion. We looked at it. And it turned out that these litigators did not even look at the record in the patent office. It turns out that the meaning of the claims were something completely different. And I'll explain if we have a little bit of time. This is worth it. So what they did was, this is technology where if you go to Sports Illustrated, you click on the Nike ad, it takes you to Nike and you do a purchase. A token follows you, a piece of software code. And when you purchase something, it triggers a commission payment. That's how the internet was built, by the way. That's what built transactions on the internet. It turned out that the smarmy patent attorney who wrote the patent application changed the meaning of token. And it turns out that the meaning of token for him was there is a suffix that travels over to the Nike website that tells you that it is a transfer connection. And he said you take off that token, you execute it, and that's what triggers the payment. Nobody does that. But the examiner looked at that and said, hey, that's different. No one's done that before. He allowed the patents. So the patents were either invalid or not infringed. So 10 months of arguing. I can't imagine how many hundreds of thousands of dollars they paid. We solved that case in 8 hours. And all a CFO has to do is step up and say, hey guys, why don't we get a second opinion? Are these patents valid? Right? Whether it's a patent troll or big stakes litigation. So you can learn these things. You can understand, watch over what these guys are doing, and understand what you can do to optimize and second guess them. Right? We're running short on time with my examples. So we're gonna head to question 3, but I want to touch briefly on investment proceeds and innovation. Often the spoils of all this non-core investment, spinning off, selling intellectual property, revenue generated by intellectual property, it's often most valuable to reinvest these types of proceeds in research and development, because that's what produced that intellectual property, and that's what produced that revenue. Keep in mind that even non-core assets and spin-outs and divestitures, you can increase their value by keeping them together, as we talked about before, and you can reinvest in other intellectual property. I want to jump to the next question now. How does your company align strategy with business, that is IP strategy with business strategy? Do you use intellectual property to guide your business strategy? Is it a C-suite commitment? Do the corporation officers commit to intellectual property and use it as a strategic asset? Is it fundamental to negotiations, or is it only asset development?
Great to speak. People are answering quickly, which we always appreciate.
Great.
And just a couple more seconds, and then we'll share that information with you.
Great.
Audience, thank you very much for answering quickly. Almost done. And we will
By the
close
way,
it.
showing 18 of 39 slides, there's a bunch of backup slides. So there's much we won't get to, but that's not relevant here.
So here's your answers, Dave. So 56% said it's a C-suite commitment, 13% fundamental to negotiations, and 31% said only asset development.
Very interesting. I would love to talk about the answers to number 3. I'd like to talk to the people who answered number 3. And if you think about in the future for a smaller group discussion, maybe a roundtable, I'd love to talk to you about how you came to that conclusion and what you can do to improve that. So very interesting statistics, very interesting. So alignment of value and risk with customer requirements and business goals. So generally, you want to be able to oversee intellectual property from the CFO's perspective and ask, how is this intellectual property aligned with value and risk and customer requirements and the business goals? So intellectual property, they support things. If you're a software company, you make warranties and representatives, and representations, and also you give indemnities to your customers. You should see and make sure that the intellectual property investments are aligned with those commitments that you're making under contracts. If you have no patents in the specific space of that contract, then you don't have a lot to back up these indemnities or these representations and warranties. So it's something to consider when you're cutting costs, you're cutting out IP, make sure that you're not cutting out IP that does support these. And if you do find IP that is tangential to your business, those intellectual property assets might be good options to sell off and invest in ones that do support your business. Also, you can, if you're buying a product or service from a vendor, intellectual property can secure your freedom to operate. I'll give you an example. Walmart has hired a company that creates robots that roam their stores and take panoramic pictures of their inventory and makes it searchable. As a vendor, they filed a few patents, but they were anti-patent, frankly, and they weren't as expansive. Walmart, on the other hand, went crazy patenting everything this vendor did. And I know I built their patent portfolio, and I trained their specialists to build their portfolios around vendors, especially when you have something that's so key to their business. So now Walmart has all the patents around their operation, and if they want to, release or sell the same services, the robots, to one of their competitors, Target or someone else, they need Walmart's permission. You don't want to be in that position. You want to be in Walmart's position to have control. Patents, intellectual property gives you control. And unless you're aware and you take control, your own customers can take control of your products so that it meets the customer's business objectives and not yours. So you want to be aware of your ecosystem, really what you're protecting. Budgets are central pillars, right? The message today is that startups and large corporations can spend like a small company and yet posture like a big company. You do not need to overspend on your intellectual property protection. You don't need to file thousands of patents around your product, depending on what industry you're in. But if you focus on what is strategic, what intellectual property and your intellectual capital, what is most valuable at protecting, supporting, or even generating revenue, that's what you want to invest in. Clients often ask me, in fact, startups have asked me, well-funded startups, how many patents should I file? What is the metric, right? And I tell them, don't look at numbers. Numbers are not watched in any industry. You want to protect the intellectual property, the intellectual capital that supports your business objectives. And often I end up talking clients out of filing more patents than they actually file. And I think that's a better result, because your intellectual property service providers should be with you for the long term, for the long game, helping you develop valuable intellectual property, not just stacking up assets and making you look big and proud. Don't worship the patents. Look at the purpose. What are the IP goals? When you're doing a buy versus a build versus buy, if you're looking at an outside component or product that you want to incorporate with your products, understand what that real value is. What will it cost for you to get that intellectual property protection if you build it yourself? Or are you better off bringing this from the inside, back to open innovation, bringing things from the outside that are better done outside, that are better built outside, and that are cost prohibitive of not just making it, but also protecting it. Financial oversight. So this is really what the point is here, especially to CFOs. You want to understand IP asset opportunities. You want to look at the business processes, objectives in your ecosystem, and look at see what can you capture in your intellectual capital. Can you get patents, copyrights? Should you use trade secrets? Should you use different mechanisms for protecting you and building your business? Don't overspend. Don't underspend in areas that are key, core to your product, and that even produces revenue or supports revenue. Assess the IP value in each opportunity. IP value is based on use in the context of your product and your business. So understand that. Ask the questions. They're not difficult questions. Sometimes they're awkward because you're asking people that may be their responsibility. But as CFOs, you can add a lot of value by helping them understand and assess their own intellectual property value and not just costs, right? And look at leverage of IP before cutting costs. As I said before, there are mechanisms now where intellectual property can be used as collateral, as leverage. If you cut them and let them expire, you're not going to have that asset to leverage. But you can quickly assess whether or not you can use it as collateral and whether it can add value to other business initiatives like borrowing money, right? And you can influence the operations for financial optimization. I've got lots more for saving, cutting costs, working with service providers. And once you understand how law firms work and other providers, you will understand how to cut costs and still maintain that same relationship with your outside providers. So in closing, be aware of business value in necessary IP assets. We talked about what are necessary costs, how do you cut costs. Figure out what are the necessary IP assets. Those are the assets that support revenue or even generate revenue. They support your business objectives. So look at those. And if someone in the company is worshiping the IP, have them articulate and explain and justify this investment in intellectual property so that it really gives business value, making it necessary. Look to leverage IP assets before cutting costs. Be a smart consumer of IP services. Optimize the spend. Work with your service providers. I got calls when March came in for all of my clients and even new clients because we're in a different space now. The world is in a different place. These outside counsel are your partners. They need to work with you. And I have found very creative ways to keep and help them maintain intellectual property without either one of us getting broken. You can work together and make this happen, right? And also create incentives for the future so that when things get better, everybody benefits from it. So now is the time to talk about that relationship. Take stock in your relationships, cut costs, but also help both of you optimize outside and inside, optimize the relationship and the protection and the opportunities that you have. and build your strategic expertise in IP. It takes time, it takes a lot of education, but CFOs, in a short amount of time, if you dedicate yourselves, you will understand more about intellectual property than you ever imagined. And your relationship with the company and your input will be richer and much more valuable.
Dave, I want to say thank you so much. You know, and I so appreciate the audience. Obviously, you had them very interested with all of your excellent information. Everyone is still on, so I won't take up any more of the audience's time, but I do want to thank you. And of course, our audience, thank you for joining us today. I know you received some valuable and practicable information from Dave. If you'd like to continue today's discussion, I encourage you to reach out to him. I'm sure, Dave, you'll be happy to answer any in-depth questions they might have. So I'll be sure to connect anyone that has any further questions. I'm happy to do that, so you can reach out to me, or there's Dave's information right there. I'm sure a message right to him is invited. So with that, I'm going to say to everybody, this does conclude the presentation on the IP Balancing Act, how to assess intellectual property as a cost-cutting value and necessary expense. Thank you to Dave and to everyone. Stay safe and stay connected.
Thanks, everybody. Reach out with any questions. Take care.